Well, g'day and welcome everybody. Damien here. I am back with another video. Now, as you may recall, I made a video last year which covered the basics of in-ear monitoring. So that video was all about how in-ear monitoring systems work, the different ways that you could build your own in-ear monitoring system depending on how much money and time and effort you wanted to put into it. Now, I received literally hundreds of comments based off that video. Comments from people who were first-timers who had never seen an in-ear system in the past, right up to professionals who just wanted to give some feedback or just some experiences about their own time with in-ear monitoring systems and discoveries that they've made. So that feedback was fantastic, and I just want to take a moment to thank everybody who did contribute to the comments in my last video, people who left comments and liked the video, subscribed to the channel. Thank you very, very much. Now, in addition to all of the comments, I also received dozens and dozens of questions, and there were two questions in particular that kept coming up. One of those questions is what I'm going to look at today. So that question was, Damien, can you run through your personal monitoring rig and talk a little bit about why you're using the equipment that you're using? Not necessarily brands, but just why that stuff was in there. What does it do and what's it all for? So we're going to be doing that today. The other question that we got was, can you help me put together my own rig? Like, what do I need for my personal rig? So this is coming from other people who are putting comments in chat. And that's a hard question to answer, but my rig, my personal rig, was based around the why I need it question, right? Because as I said, the aim of this video is going to be really to walk through my equipment. Hopefully, by going through my rig and understanding why I chose what I chose, that'll give you the ammunition to be able to go ahead and start building your own in-ear monitoring rig. Now, a lot of what we're going to look at today also assumes that you have a basic understanding of in-ear monitoring concepts. Now, if you don't, or if you're a little bit rusty, I'd strongly recommend checking out my previous video, which goes into more of an in-ear monitoring 101 approach, I would say, which talks about those concepts more fundamentally rather than diving headfirst into gear and setups, which is what we're going to be doing today. So if you're a bit rusty, go and check that out first and then come back and we'll kick on. Okay, so here's my in-ear rig in its entirety as it exists today. Now, I'm showing you both a front and a rear view here. And obviously all the cabling has been removed in these pictures so that you can have a better view of everything that's going on in there. So let's talk firstly about the case itself. So the case itself, I've gone for the Gator GRR10L. Now, no particular reason for going Gator necessarily, but I did need to have a case that had enough depth that was, more than, I think, 300 millimeters or 30 centimeters to accommodate the depth of all of the different components. Now, the X32 rack, which we'll talk about in a minute, that was by far the deepest component that I had, and that came in at around about 300 millimeters. So I needed to make sure that the rack itself could accommodate that. Now, the rack is made from polyethylene, so it's a plastic construction, and it's 10 rack units high. I obviously needed to know what needed to go in this rack before I bought the rack itself, but 10 rack units was actually perfect for what I needed. The other good thing about the GRR10L is that it has a handle and wheels. Some of this stuff gets pretty heavy once you start adding all the cabling in there. So having a handle and wheels is obviously going to be quite beneficial to keep things easy to lift and move around. Now, for protection, just a point here, it's actually better to have a floating rack if you can. Now, a floating rack is generally constructed a lot more sturdily, and the interior rack itself floats. It sits between foam, and so that means if you're ever carting this stuff around and it's going to be subjected to knocks and bangs, it's not going to transfer directly into your equipment and risk damaging anything. Now, the floating racks are actually a lot heavier than the Gator unit that I've got. And since I'm the only one that's carting this stuff around most nights anyway, I'm happy to use the Gator case and just a little bit of care as opposed to adding an additional 50 kilograms to the overall weight by using a floating rack. But if you're using this stuff at home, or if you're putting it on airplanes and traveling with this sort of stuff, I'd strongly recommend maybe looking into those floating cases. Now, the Gator rack has wing clips, which most cases of this kind do. There's also a locking front and back cover, which is handy. Fairly standard stuff, really. And just to reiterate, you don't really want to be looking at buying a case until after you decide how many rack unit spaces your rig is going to need to take up. Okay, so we need to sort out that first. All right, so looking at the internals of the case, the first thing there at the top, the first rack unit, is the Furman PL Plus CE power conditioner. Okay, now this power conditioner comes with lights and a voltmeter, which is quite handy because, often I'm working in the dark, as you often do on stage, so the lights are fairly handy, and being able to show a voltmeter just at a glance is also fairly useful. So let's talk about this first. What does the Furman power conditioner do? Well, it actually powers my entire rig, and so the first benefit here is that everything in my rig can actually plug into this Furman power conditioner, and then there's one cable that comes out and runs into the wall socket. So I don't need to plug everything in separately into a wall socket. I could actually just plug everything into the power conditioner, and then all of that stuff just then transfers out to the wall socket with one cable, which is quite handy. So when it comes time for pack up, I have one cable to unplug from the wall socket, tuck it into the unit, and I'm ready to go. So the power conditioner, what does this actually do? Well, it conditions the power, and what that means is it stabilizes, actually does a couple of things, but it stabilizes the power that comes into the rig. So this keeps the equipment that you've got in there safer by protecting it from things like power surges and spikes, and just essentially keeps the components functioning more efficiently without them being subjected to those potential power issues that we talked about, or what we call dirty power in the industry. Now, this little display at the top, the 240 volt display, gives me a snapshot of the kinds of power that's coming into the unit. Now, in Australia where I live, nominal voltage is around about 230 volts, 110 in the US, and it's a little bit different in other regions of the world. But for Australia, it's 230 volts. But that can actually fluctuate everywhere from 216 volts right up to 250. So that's one of the reasons why I have something like the power conditioner there. That helps to regulate the voltage that's hitting all of those other components in my rig. Okay, and as I mentioned before, it lights everything up. So this is great for dark environments like a stage. Okay, so moving down, the second item that we have here, this is the Sennheiser IEM G4. Complicated name, but this is my wireless in-ear monitoring system. So this is the unit that provides the in-ear mix, and it sends that wirelessly to one or two musicians on stage. So it actually accepts two inputs, so I can send two in-ear mixes to it. Either two mono sends, so I could send it to two separate musicians, each who have a body pack, or, as I explained in the last video, I could actually use those two channels as a stereo mix, a left and a right, and then send that wirelessly using the Sennheiser unit to one person in the band. Currently, it's being set on mono mode, so this in-ear monitoring system will feed two musicians on stage. Now, this unit itself only takes up half a rack space, so the left side that you can see there is actually just a blank plate, but eventually there's actually going to be another one of these IEM G4 units in there, and so that will then give me the opportunity to send 4 different mixes wirelessly to members on my stage, which is great because I have 4 additional members in my band in addition to myself. Or I could run 2 stereo mixes when I'm playing with my 3-piece band. Okay. Moving down from there, we then have the Behringer X32 rack. So this is my digital mixer. This is the brains of the operation, and it's where I'm going to accept all of the inputs into my in-ear rig system, mix them, and send them out to the various devices that I'm using. Okay, so whether I'm mixing for a front of house mix, or whether it's purely for in-ear mixes, or whether I'm playing backing tracks, or live streaming, or recording performances to my laptop, everything goes through this X32 rack. It really is the central source of this whole IEM system that I'm using. Now, it's actually very much like a traditional mixing desk. So if you think about, those mixing desks that you would see at venues that have all of the faders and knobs and dials, that's kind of what this thing is, but it's mounted in a rack. It's 3 units high and mounted in a rack. It also has multiple outputs, which are going to be able to drive floor monitors, or sometimes called foldback speakers. I could drive subs from that. I could drive my front of house system from that, or in-ears in my case. All right, so there is a question there about how many different mixes we're driving, but the Behringer X32 has 8 XLR outputs, so I could typically drive 8 different speakers or 8 different mixes out of that mixing desk. Now, by adding a little router Now, I don't have the router pictured, but by adding a basic router, all of these mixers that I'm talking about get mixed inside the X32 rack. But typically they're controlled and mixed by external devices. So you'll notice that if we have a look quickly back at the X32 rack, there doesn't appear to be any channel faders or knobs or dials that you can sort of see or operate manually, because even though all of that stuff could be controlled on board the X32 rack, the idea is actually to run all of this stuff from something like an iPad, and even actually from a phone app, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. So everyone controls their own mix individually. There's no one person that has to do it all. And this is really important because a lot of the places that I'm playing, we don't even have an in-house operator. The requirement on us is for us to do our own mix, and if something doesn't sound right, we need to tweak and adjust it ourselves. In order to send all of that information from the X32 rack to the various iPads and iPhones around the room, I need to incorporate a router. So when we think about a router, we talk about internet, right? Being able to contact the internet or connect to the internet. And the router, what that does is it takes the internet connection and it sends it to various devices, let's say in your home, so that all of those devices could connect to the internet. Now, we're not connecting to the internet when we do an in-ear mix, but what the router does is it enables these devices, these iPads and these iPhones, to connect to the X32 rack. Not to the internet, but connect wirelessly to the X32 and to see what's going on board inside the X32. And so therefore they can then control various outputs or various aspects of the X32 by using their phone or their iPad. So we need a little router to do that. And I literally have, I can't even remember the model number. I'll put it up on screen when I get a chance to look at it. But it's literally the cheapest. I think it's a TP-Link. It's just a little square thing that sits at the back and plugs into my X32 so that when we get to a venue, we can see that the X32 comes up as a Wi-Fi device on our phones or on our iPad, and we can connect to that securely and control the X32 from our iPads or phones. Now, the other reason this is important is because the in-ear rig that I'm running may not be close to us. Because I'm going to be splitting channels, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second, it may be the case that this in-ear monitoring rig needs to be way off to the side of stage somewhere, not next to me where I can just turn around and adjust it. So having wireless control of that rack without being physically near that rack is actually really important for some of the gigs that we play. Okay, so moving down from there, now we move on to the next component in my rack, which is the Behringer S16. And this is a digital snake, and it has several functions, but I'm using it in my rack to provide additional XLR inputs and outputs from the X32 rack. So it's important to note here that the X32 rack actually supports 32 inputs, but only 16 of those inputs are actually XLR connections. Now, if you've done live shows, you know that most of the time the industry standard is that if you're plugging in a microphone, that connection is going to be XLR. And that's great for 16 channels, but if you need more than 16 channels plugged into your X32 rack, all of a sudden you're going to be out of XLR inputs. So if you wanted to plug in more than 16 microphones, you're going to need to add more XLR connections. Now, as I said before, the X32 rack accommodates 32 inputs, but it only has 16 of those inputs available to you as XLR format. Okay. Now, the S16 connects to the X32 rack by using a specific cable. Now, it's a Cat5e cable, but it's a Cat5e cable that's shielded and also lockable, so it's not going to be able to be pulled out if somebody sort of yanks on that cable. Now, this cable provides what they call an AES50 connection to the X32 rack. And that AES50 is just a fancy way of saying that it connects and sends multiple channels of audio back and forth to the X32 rack using an Ethernet connection. Okay, so now in addition to the 16 XLR channels that I have at the back of my X32 rack, I now, thanks to the S16, have an additional 16 XLR inputs, and you can see them there on the front, but also an extra 8 outputs that I can use and control from my Behringer X32 rack. All right, so moving down from there, the next thing we have in the series is the Art S8. Now, this is an 8-channel microphone splitter. Now, I have the two-way version. There's actually a three-way version that I didn't need, but in hindsight, it actually might have been handy. But of course, it all comes down to money at the end of the day. So the ART S8 is actually, as I said, a microphone splitter. And what this does is it duplicates any single microphone that gets plugged into it. So when a single mic is plugged into the front channel, you can see that two equivalent channels exit the back on the S8. So in situations where our mics need to go to an in-house desk, but we also want to take a feed of that channel ourselves for an in-ear mix, we can use the S8 to duplicate the signal right at the source here. Okay? When we split the mic channel, one of those sends goes to the X32 rack. So now we're going to be able to hear that channel. But the other send of that same channel then goes out to the front of house desk. So we use this splitting or duplicating concept to take a copy of what the microphones are picking up without having to steal the signal that has to go front of house. Now, it's not every situation and every gig that we need to do this, by the way, but that situation does occur, and that's why those S8s are sitting there. Now, the last item in our rig is the ART P16. Now, this is a 16-channel XLR Patchbay. It's not absolutely essential that we have this, but it does offer a simple and quick way to connect and disconnect channels to external desks and to different systems. Now, the two ART S8s plug into this ART P16, but the problem here is that the S8's outputs are on the back of my rig, and the S8 is actually quite a shallow unit. It doesn't protrude very far into the back of the rig, and so they're quite hard to reach, especially when everything's cabled from the back, and it's almost impossible to see those outputs from the back. The outputs that I'm referring to are the outputs that need to go to the front of house. As I mentioned before, the first copy that comes out of those S8s goes to my X32 rack, and that goes into those X32 XLR channels that we talked about, and they stay there hardwired and never get disconnected. But it may very well be the case that night after night, if I'm having to use those splitters and send channels to the front of desk, then I'm going to be plugging and unplugging snakes or looms or individual cables to the back of these S8s and send them to front of house. And that's going to take time. We're going to potentially misconnect things. Things may not get connected properly. So what I can do is hardwire all of those front of house sends and patch them into this ART P16. And so what that does, by feeding those outputs from the S8s into the P16 patch bay, I can take those 16 output channels and bring everything to the front, label everything, and then if we do need to take a connection, we can actually connect those snakes or looms from the front of my in-ear rig with all of the different outputs labeled and take that straight out and on to the sound engineer. So in a normal scenario, when we're splitting, the sound engineer will say, well, I have a stage box on the side of stage that I will plug all the microphones in, and he will have that labeled, which will say, my 3 vocal mics are going in here, and then the kick drum mic is plugged in here, the snare goes here, the toms goes here. So his stage box is actually labeled with where he intends to plug all of his microphones in. So when it comes time for me to turn up and I have my in-ear monitoring rig, if I have a patch bay at the front that is all preset and ready to go with everything labeled, even if it's just channels 1 through to 16, then when I take a split by plugging all of his microphones into my S8s, I don't have to start feeling around the back to try and plug everything in to send to his stage box. We can literally plug the loom into the front of house and take those 16 splits directly out of the front of my rig and go directly into his stage box, which oftentimes is sitting right next to his stage box. And this talks once again to the reason why I prefer to control the X32 with an iPad, because as I mentioned before, this stage box, my in-ear monitoring rig most of the time needs to be near those stage boxes. And a lot of the time, particularly when you get to bigger shows, you may find that there are more than one stage box, there's more than one stage box on the stage, and so you have to place your in-ear monitoring rig somewhere that can reach all of them. But again, I don't want the added problem of having to feel around the back to try and get him the cables that he needs. We literally plug and unplug all of those connections from the front of the unit and then push the monitoring ring right to the back where it's out of the way. Okay, so that's a rundown of all of the different things that I'm using in my rig. Now let's talk about why that stuff is there. And we've gone into it in a little bit of detail, but this is where I'm going to start talking about the different environments that I perform in, and therefore why this stuff exists and why it's in my rig. So this first scenario is where we arrive at a venue. There's no in-house PA, there's no sound engineer, there's no mixing desk, nothing. We have to bring all of it in. So in situations like that, we're not only using the in-ear monitoring rig for our in-ear monitoring, but we're also using it as a front of house desk. We're fortunate that we have members of our band that have all the equipment that we need. So we have front of house speakers, we have subwoofers, we have all of that. But I will bring the in-ear monitoring rig and we will connect everything from that. So in those situations, we will be using the in-ear monitoring rig also as a front of house system. We don't have to therefore worry about things like splitting channels because we're not sending the microphone signals anywhere but our own monitoring rig or our own monitoring desk, so the X32 rack. And so when we plug the microphones in, it is simply a case of plugging into the S8s. Those S8s, of course, are feeding those sends straight through to the X32 rack. And then what we should find is that however many inputs that we need, sometimes it's less than 8, sometimes it's more than 16, that all of that is in the X32 rack ready for us to go. So this is quite a simple scenario in that we're not splitting. It's complicated because we have to bring more gear, obviously, speakers and all of that sort of stuff, but we don't have to worry about splitting or caring about what anyone else is doing. We just set our own mix on that front of house through that desk and also for our in-ear mixes. So one of the benefits of having something like an X32 rack is that, as I said before, we have multiple sends or multiple outputs. Some of those outputs are going to our in-ear monitoring system. I have 2 sends because I'm listening to it in stereo. Some of our other musicians are only listening in mono. But we need to make sure that we've got 2 outputs that are going left and right to front of house. Now, as it so happens, the Behringer X32 rack with 8 outputs doesn't quite provide us as much as we need. As I said, I'm taking 2 outputs. We have 2 guitarists at the front who are taking another 2 outputs. We have the bass player who's taking 1 output, and our keyboardist potentially, depending on the gig, will take 3 outputs. So even just amongst the in-ear sends within our band, we have 8 channels. That doesn't provide any more channels to go out front of house. And so once again, this is where that S16 stage box comes into it, because by connecting the S16 stage box to the X32, we not only get those additional 16 XLR inputs, but also 8 more outputs. And I take the last 2 of those outputs for sending those 2 channels to front of house. So the first 8 on board the X32 rack are used for our in-ears, and the 2 furthermost outputs are then taken from the S16 to drive our front of house mix. So the next scenario that we come across, and this is one that I have to deal with often, is where the venue itself has a PA system installed, it has its own desk provided, but there's no operator, there's no sound engineer. It's actually up to the band themselves to mix themselves. Now, the challenge with this, of course, is you really don't know in what sort of working condition that mixing desk may be. Some channels may not work. You don't know how the last band that was there may have left the settings. It might be horrible. You really don't know what you're walking into. And so for that reason alone, it's often a good idea to bring your own in-ear rig anyway to hear yourselves. But the other thing is, since we bring as part of our in-ear rig our own mixing desk, there becomes the question of, do we use ours to drive the front of house sound, or do we use the one in the venue? Now, you can actually plug everything into your, or in my case, my Behringer X32 rack, my in-ear rig, and split everything using those S8s we talked about and send as much of that stuff onto the house mixer as you like. But often the house mixing board is not going to be 32 channels. I mean, good luck to you if it is. Some of the times, in fact, most of the time it's maybe 8, and you'll be lucky if 4 of them work. So it becomes a question of, well, how much stuff do we split and send to that mixing desk? In in actual fact, what usually happens is that we will actually plug everything into the Behringer X32 rack. We will mix everything in the Behringer X32 rack and then just send a stereo mix out to the in-house mixing desk, which means it's only going to require 2 channels to be functional on that desk. We leave everything flat, all of the EQ, everything is set to 0. We mix everything on board the X32, and then it's just a left and right out, where we're literally using that desk as a conduit to feed the speakers in that venue. Nothing else. Right? All of the mixing is done in the X32. That's great because, of course, we can plug in as many mics and channels as we want now. We're not limited by the venue's desk. It also means that we'll be able to take that mix with us. So if we're playing at that venue again in 4 weeks' time, well, the mix that we had set on our X32 rack just gets recalled. We send that left and right back out to the house desk and we're ready to go again. Now, there is a caveat to this. And if you're at a venue where the in-house desk also drives some stage monitors, and as I explained in the last video, those monitors often give the musicians what they need to hear, then it's probably the case that that house desk can also send separate mixes to those separate speakers. So for example, if you have a guitarist who's sitting on the right-hand side of your stage and there's a monitor there that is plugged into the mixing desk that is owned by the venue itself, then if you plug the guitar channel into that mixing desk, then as part of the output to that monitor, you can adjust through that desk how much guitar goes out into that monitor. Now, of course, if we're plugging everything into the X32 rack, and only a left and right combined mix is going to that stage desk, then you lose the option to have separate mixes for each stage monitor. Now, in a lot of cases, that doesn't matter at all because part of the reason we even have an in-ear monitoring system is to remove the need to have stage monitors, right? Because of course, we're getting our own mix in our ears. But sometimes, particularly for bass players and drummers, it's actually quite useful to have those monitors on because they're much larger speakers, obviously, than you'll have in your ears. And so it can add a little bit of thump to the stage sound, and sometimes it just feels good to have that. So again, you'll have to decide when you get there how you deal with your setup. But for us, most of the time, it doesn't really matter whether the mixing desk accommodates enough channels for what we want to mix, or even if some of them are not working. As long as there's 2 channels working, most of the time in this scenario, we will turn up with a lot of the time our own microphones, but everything's going to be plugged into our mixing desk on board the IEM rig, and it's just going to be a stereo out where all of the mixing decisions and adjustments are going to be made using the X32 rack, not the house desk. Now, the third scenario, the third environment that we play in is probably the more classic environment for larger shows, and it's where there's a PA provided. There is a separate desk where everything is being mixed from for the front of house or the audience sound, and there's an engineer to run it. So this is one of those scenarios where we're going to have to split everything. If we want to hear what's going on, we need to take a copy of all of those microphone channels. Now, these will typically not be our own microphones. They will not typically be plugged into our equipment. They're going to be plugged into a stage box. So a caveat here, you need to be careful because if there's anywhere from sort of 8 to 32 channels being plugged in on stage, that's quite a significant setup, and you need to let the sound engineer know if you're going to be bringing an in-ear rig and you're planning on splitting everything, he may need to make considerations for that, and you may need to make considerations in terms of, as I said before, where you put the stage box and the IEMs and all that sort of stuff. But you need to give your sound engineer advance notice that that's going to happen. If you're playing on a bill where it's like a festival, or if you're playing on a local show where you're really not going to be on stage for very long, or there's very short changeovers, you might want to consider not even bringing your IEM rig because it's probably going to be more hassle than it's worth. In a scenario where we may be the headlining band and there might be 2 or 3 support acts, what we typically do is we will bring the in-ear monitoring rig earlier in the day as part of our line check or our sound check, if you know what that means. And we will actually set everything up there, and when we split the signals, it basically runs for everybody, although we're the only ones that are modifying it. So it's important to backtrack now and talk a little about these splits that we talked before. because we have our in-ear rig that is splitting via the S8s, remember that we get a copy of everything that's being mic'd up, and that gets fed into our X32 rack. Now, even if there's 4 or 5 bands on the bill, we're the only ones using the X32 rack, but part of the benefit of having those splits is that the other copy of those splits does still continue through onto that stage box and onto that sound engineer. So by getting there early and setting this stuff up, not only do we get to ensure that everything has been split and connected correctly, but when the other bands come on, when the opening bands come on and play, the X32 rack and the in-ear monitoring rig is still on. It's just not being used. It's actually, everything's going through that to the front of house mix. And so the other benefit of that is when those support bands are on stage, there's nothing stopping me from grabbing an iPad and actually starting to mix those bands so that I can get, 90% of the way there for when we get on stage. Okay, now of course, because that support band is not using our in-ear monitoring system or anything like that, what I adjust, they're not going to have to hear. Remember, there will still probably be monitors on stage. The other bands might even have in-ear racks for themselves, or they might be leveraging the front of house sound engineer to send them an in-ear feed, whatever it may be. But the bottom line is we can have our equipment set up prior and even on and operational, and that means that it doesn't stop the other bands from doing what they want, and it also means that I can actually start mixing and getting my band close to the sound that it needs based off the inputs of the other bands that are playing. So that's really, really handy. There's actually a second half to this, or a sort of a second scenario when you have this whole PA provided and operator provided scenario, and that's if they're using a desk that is compatible with the Behringer X32 rack. And this is actually one of the reasons I bought the X32 rack over other rack digital mixers that are available. There is a system at play within the Behringer and Midas environments where if the front of house desk is a Behringer desk, a compatible Behringer desk or Midas desk, to the X32 rack that I have, I actually don't need to take any splits of anything. One of the beautiful things that it can do is it can use this AES50, this Cat5e connection that we discussed earlier, and the sound engineer front of house can actually send, using AES50, an Ethernet cable back to my X32, which can give me access to all 32 channels that he or she may be using without having to do any splitting from on stage. So it is a separate send of all of his channels back to me and independent of his mix, right? So back to me, which I can get with one cable rather than splitting 16 different microphones, which is awesome. But again, caveats to that. Has to be a compatible desk, which is usually only isolating it down to either Behringer or Midas compatible desks in my case, because I'm using the X32 rack. It also means that he, she, or myself need to have the cable that connects those two desks. And remember, those desks could be 100 feet apart or more. So I'd need to have a cable that would accommodate that. So it's the same concept. I'm still pulling my own in-ear rig system and in-ear mix and feedback, but I'm not actually splitting anything to do it. So it's a very novel way to go, but honestly, in my experience, it's rare that that scenario exists. I get all excited when I go to shows and I see that they're running a Behringer desk, but oftentimes they either don't have the necessary infrastructure to get me what I need to be able to run it that way, or they're not willing to do it, or their desk is set up in such a way that I would need to make multiple adjustments to my rack to make it even work. So for example, sample rates may be set differently, or their channel structure might be completely something that I haven't anticipated. So most of the time, if they're willing to do the physical splits from those ART S8s, that's the way I will do it. But this all comes under that same umbrella of what do we do in scenarios where there's a PA provided and a sound engineer. We need to take splits of everything, and it's either going to be splits via the S8s on stage next to the stage box, or if we're really, really lucky, he may be able to give us a Cat5e cable from his compatible desk where we can get a send of all of those channels without having to split everything on stage. So that sums it up. So hopefully now you get an understanding of why I have the gear I have, why I have as much gear as I have. Now I'm in environments, as I said, I'm playing sometimes with 7 channels or less, in which case I don't need to bring all of that stuff in that rack, right up to using 32 channels. Now I also use playback scenarios on stage, so playing back sequences and backing tracks and stuff like that. I won't go how that's done today, but I think it might be worth another video because the X32 rack is involved in that process as well. But hopefully you get an understanding of why that stuff is there, what I use it for and why it's important for me. By all means, if you do have questions about what you think you may need, let me know in the comments below what sort of environments you're playing in, what sort of equipment you're considering, and ask the questions. Let's get the dialogue open. I'd like to once again thanks all of you for watching the video. If you did like it, please give a like and consider subscribing to the channel. Hopefully we'll get some more of this stuff happening, but in the meantime, bye for now and thank you for enjoying the content.